An important part of New York City's history lies hidden throughout what is now Central Park. Although it may be difficult to imagine, Central Park was once private property, occupied by a variety of businesses and residences, including an African-American neighborhood called Seneca Village. History books have often portrayed that the park was built on swamps inhabited by squatters living in a shanty town, but recent research has uncovered details proving that this theory isn't true. Seneca Village was a thriving African-American community of landowners when few black people in America had the opportunity to own their own land. Before the last 20 years or so, Seneca Village had largely been forgotten about, like many former African-American towns where the residents were forced out by both public officials like police and politicians and private residents. But what exactly happened to Seneca Village and who lived there? In this video, I'll tell you about how Seneca Village came to be, the vibrant community that called the neighborhood home, and what happened after they were forced to leave the area. Here's the story of Seneca Village. The neighborhood known as Seneca Village first came to be in 1825 when free and ambitious African-American New Yorkers began to buy parcels of farmland sold by John Whitehead, a white delivery man in the northern part of Manhattan. Historians speculate that black New Yorkers living downtown began moving to the northern outskirts of Manhattan, in part to escape the racist climate and unhealthy conditions of lower Manhattan. In the 1820s, when they first began settling in the area, the built-up part of the city ended at around Washington Square in lower Manhattan, and the population was approximately 150,000. The first parcels of land were bought from Whitehead by Andrew Williams, an African-American bootblack, who purchased 6 lots of land for $125. Epiphany Davis, a laborer and trustee of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, bought 12 lots for $578 the same day. The church itself then bought 6 lots. Between 1825 and 1832, real estate records show that the Whiteheads sold at least 24 land parcels to black families. Because New York emancipated its slaves gradually, full emancipation didn't take effect until 1827. But throughout the 1820s, there were already free African Americans in the state. A lot of people who had owned slaves in New York began emancipating them in the 1790s. After William and Davis made their initial purchases, other freed blacks began moving to the Seneca Village area too. There was also a small number of German and Irish immigrants who settled in Seneca Village. Among the later Irish residents were the Plunketts, one of whose sons, George Washington Plunkett, born in 1842, grew into the Tammany boss best remembered for distinguishing between honest and dishonest graft. Land in Seneca Village was considerably less expensive than in the main downtown areas of New York City. In some cases, African Americans who lived in other parts of the city bought land in Seneca Village just so they could be landowners. African American males who were landowners were, under the New York State Constitution of 1821, entitled to vote if they owned property worth at least $250. Of the 100 black New Yorkers eligible to vote in 1845, 10 lived in Seneca Village. The isolated location of the land in Seneca Village made it affordable to newly employed African Americans. A nearby natural spring known as Tanner Spring today provided the fresh drinking water necessary for the community. Within a few years of the first parcels being sold, Seneca Village developed into a stable settlement, with African Americans owning more than half the households in the neighborhood. The area in and around Seneca Village consisted of farmland and large rocks scattered the area. To the west was the Hudson River, a place for fishing and swimming. Open space was also likely a draw for many who bought land in the community. Most houses in Seneca Village were small by today's standards, but unlike the crowded conditions in downtown New York, residents could have backyards and gardens. By the 1840s, Seneca Village was a multi-ethnic community of African Americans, Irish, and German immigrants. There were 3 churches, 2 African Methodist and 1 Catholic, a school called Colored School No. 3, which was one of the few integrated schools in New York City, and several cemeteries. West 85th Street seemed to have been the main street of Seneca Village. The 1855 census shows that 87.5% of the households in the village were headed by men, 37% of the adults in the community could read, and that 60% of the daughters and 66% of the sons over the age of 16 were reported as employed. Seneca Village residents displayed an unusual permanency in the area at a time when much of America was moving around the burgeoning nation. Virtually every black Seneca family counted in the 1850 census was still there 5 years later. In contrast, 40% of the population of Boston moved in the same 5-year period. The origin of the Seneca Village's name is still uncertain according to most experts. Some historians believe that the village was named after the Seneca tribe of the Native Americans who inhabited regions in the area. Others believe it was derived from a variation of the country named Senegal, where many of the village's residents may have come from. The word Senegal may have also been a code word used by Underground Railroad fugitives or named in homage to Roman philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca, whose book Seneca's Morals was popular among African American activists. In 1853, the New York State Legislature enacted a law that set aside 775 acres of land in Manhattan, authorizing the use of eminent domain to confiscate private property between 59th and 106th Streets, later extended to 110th Street for public purposes. The nearly 1,600 residents of Seneca Village received final eviction notices during the summer of 1856. Although property holders were compensated, many protested in the courts. As the residents of Seneca Village were building up a thriving neighborhood, the people of Lower Manhattan were looking for other, more aesthetically pleasing things to do with the area it occupied in the upper parts of the city. At the time, Lower Manhattan was overflowing with immigrants, and the wealthy, more affluent families in the borough started to look for other places to make their homes. The upper eastern part of Manhattan is where the search took them, directly across from Seneca Village. Once all the affluent families started moving to the Upper East Side, they began wanting outdoor space. Real estate developers quickly jumped on the idea of a wealthy community with lush greenery and began looking into securing the area in the center of Manhattan, including the prime real estate that Seneca Village stood upon. Frederick Olmsted, the initial builder and superintendent of Central Park, believed American prosperity required infrastructure, which in turn required broad public support and engagement with affected communities. After traveling as a reporter in the southern United States and seeing a lack of public space, Olmsted wanted to see the South and the rest of the country build public and democratically accessible canals, roads, town squares, parks, schools, and libraries. While town squares and parks partially existed in the South, Olmsted found through his travels there were very few roads and schools and no restaurants or libraries. The South had no public realm in Olmsted's view. It was all private land in the form of massive plantations. In the South, capital was invested in private land and human bodies and little else. Those in favor of the creation of Central Park characterized Seneca Village as a wasteland populated by squatters and shanties. Although this was an accurate description of a very small portion of the seized property, it was an unfair description of the village as a whole, which was full of hardworking residents. Seneca was the site of some smelly industries like bone boiling to make glue. There were institutional homes for the poor, criminal, and disabled, and many people did live in tiny, squalid quarters, though perhaps no worse than families crowded into tenements downtown. Even so, these are all services a functioning community should provide to its needy residents. The fact that many residents were property owners contradicts the prevailing misperceptions of the mid-19th century that the people living on the land slated for the park were poor squatters living in shanties. While some residents lived in shanties in crowded conditions, most lived in two-story homes. Census records show that residents were employed, with African Americans typically working as laborers and in service jobs, the main options for them at that time. Records also show that most children who lived in Seneca Village attended school. The New York Sun, one of the few newspapers sympathetic to the residents of Seneca Village, reported in 1857 that most people asked permission from property owners before building makeshift homes. Some living on the land even paid a small ground rent and raised fruits and vegetables on patches of land that otherwise would have been unproductive. No photographs of the village have been found, and much of what is known about the physical layout of the community is based on evidence like surveyor maps and the landmarks that are still present in the park. Almost all of Seneca Village was destroyed when Central Park was built. Two of its churches, All Angels Episcopal and Mother AME Zion, still exist. In the 1950s, a Parks Department gardener found a graveyard around 85th Street, which a New Yorker said was, quote, filled with the bones of tramps and squatters, end quote. The New York Herald of 1871 published an article about finding decomposed bodies in the course of uprooting trees to build the West 85th entrance to the park. Fortunately, over the last decade, Seneca Village has been reborn in the work of archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists exploring the histories of once thriving African American towns that were razed. In 2005, an archaeological dig of the area that was once Seneca Village by students and faculty at Barnard College uncovered broken pottery, including pieces imported from Asia, clay pipes, broken glass bottles, including a large piece from the Libman Brewery in Brooklyn, hand and machine-made nails, and bones of butchered animals that gave a sense of the income and diet of the villagers. A major focus of the dig showed that while newspaper accounts at the time described the homes in the village as shacks, city and court records show that some families in the community lived in 3-story timber homes and lived stable and abundant lives. The story of what happened to Seneca Village is troubling to say the least. Olmsted, the builder who originally designed and constructed the park, wanted to build a democratic space accessible as a public square for New York residents. It's hard, though, to call the haphazard process of forcing residents off their land democratic, especially when the relocation was done with so little care that the fate of those who lived in Seneca Village is largely unknown. The idea of Central Park itself wasn't bad. The execution was, though. Like I mentioned, the park was built in a location that primarily benefited the wealthy residents in Manhattan, far away from other New Yorkers and other parts of the city. Whether they were paid or not, the African American homeowners in Seneca Village were made to move so that the affluent white residents of Upper Manhattan can build a park. Seneca Village, Lake Lanier, Tulsa, every part of the Trail of Tears, and the removal of natives across the United States. There are too many similar stories in our nation's history where less powerful communities were forced off their land, sometimes violently, without just compensation. I've been to Central Park many times in my trips into New York City, and it's a lovely place. But after extensively researching the history of the park and how it was built, I don't think I'll enjoy it in the same way again. And I'll definitely see it with a new lens. One pointed towards the history of Central Park and the people that once called it home. So tell me, did you know the history of Central Park? Did you know it was built on top of a once thriving community called Seneca Village? Leave a comment and let me know what you think. And of course, let's always honor the people that we discuss in these videos. Until next time, this is Black Rhetoric. Thanks.